Software Engineering Radio, episode 104, Plugin Architectures.
This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers, on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio brings you relevant and detailed discussions and interviews on software engineering topics every 10 days. Thanks to our audience and the partners listed on our website for supporting the podcast.
So welcome listeners to our new episode on Software Engineering Radio. In this episode we will talk about some architecture stuff. Especially in this episode we will talk about the architecture style of building applications out of plugins. So the idea of plugins and what is a plugin will be discussed in this episode. And on the mic is Martin, and we have invited a guest, and the guest is Klaus Marquardt, and I would like to ask Klaus Marquardt to introduce himself. So Klaus, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello, welcome. Now, thank you for the welcome. My name is Klaus Marquardt. I work for Jaeger Medical. That is a company in Lübeck, Germany, building life-supporting systems like ventilation devices. And unlike you might expect, I have no experience with plugins using Eclipse, but instead I have extensive experience using plugins in, for example, medical applications.
Oh, that would be, I think, quite interesting. So I have some experiences using plugins with Eclipse, and with some completely different domain. So it's I think we will have fun.
Okay.
So I think let's dive right into the topic, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think that the basic first question is basically what is a plugin? So everybody talks about plugins, and since Eclipse is out, everybody say, okay, everything is a plugin now, and the world consists out of plugins. But so let's talk about, let's make clear what is a plugin, maybe in contrast to add-ons, modules, components, and all those other terms that are flying around. So what do you think? What is a plugin?
Well, a plugin is an extension to an application that is intended to be extended. So that was very generic definition. You have mentioned other terms like modules, and modules is probably the most generic term we know in software. A module is pretty much everything that has some boundary. Whereas if you look at components, well, that is more specific. Components are building blocks of some application, but typically components do not know which application they are being made for. And that is the intent behind most components. And the intent of plugins is different because they know exactly what applications they are made for. And vice versa, the applications really are defined with the idea of being extensible. So if you consider a web browser is defined with the idea of extending for new data formats and new presentation styles and so on, which is just not a component style way of designing an application.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the web browser like Firefox or whatever that could be extended by plugins. And if I think about the Eclipse idea of building the whole application out of different platforms, it seems like there's a difference between, let's say, maybe plugin-based applications and should we call it extensible applications?
Well, I'm not sure we use the same wording here. Talking about Eclipse, I'd say, well, this is basically a platform for plugins. So Eclipse provides plugin mechanisms. That's the core of the idea behind Eclipse. Whereas if you look at applications, one famous example is the Acrobat Reader, or the entire Acrobat program. Actually, the idea of the Acrobat program was not that it's a platform for some extensible behavior, But the idea was that it's a document exchange program and a document display program. And all the extensibilities, like, well, we can comment on it and so on, are then implemented in the style of plugins. So it's in a style, it's more like an add-on. The application is useful even without plugins, and this also is valid for web browsers. But with plugins or add-ons, you can increase the value for the user.
Ah, okay. So you say basically that we have different kind of let's say plugin-based systems. So we have these kind of applications that can be used right away as they are, and their functionality can be extended using some small plugins that sit on top of those applications. And that are maybe other kinds of applications, or you mentioned the term platform, or let's say maybe it's a plugin infrastructure that allows you to build applications out of plugins. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say so. I've been using plugins with industrial automation, so to say. So not just in the medical domain, but also in medical laboratories, where we had chemical analyzers, and they needed a particular communication protocol in order to convey information about the samples and the patients and so on. And we built a software that contacted many different laboratory analyzers. So it was kind of an integration system. And the system actually would not have been useful without any plug-in for a chemical analyzer. So it's basically it's an application that is intended to be extensible by plugins, and without the first plugin it doesn't make any sense at all. But later on, and this is the nice thing about this kind of application, it can be extended, well, for years or decades even. Pretty much like an operating system. So when you define an operating system, you also have entry points like device drivers, and you can pretty much add device drivers anytime you like. Whereas an operating system is very generic, and so what I used in the industrial environment is the term driver, actually, to explain the concept of a plugin. Because when we did this in the early to mid 90s, the term plugin was not used very often. So it was a term that was used, but it needed explanation at that time. And nowadays, everybody's talking about plugins, everybody's using plugins, and everybody has the idea that a plugin is something that can extend behavior of an already existing system.
And can maybe closely integrate it into that system so that fits nicely into the existing other plugins or other applications.
Yeah, this is an interesting point, because what I've seen is that we are talking about extension points now. And frameworks or applications that make use of plugins that typically offer a variety of extension points. That is, a plugin may come and bring very different things, not just a description or an interpretation ability of some file format, but also some display properties. It integrates into existing menus of the application and so on. So we have a lot of areas where we can add behavior to the application.
I think you mentioned the term extension point. I think we should come back to that point, extension point, in more detail later in this episode, because it sounds like you're using the term extension point as some kind of concept on the conceptual level, and I of course think of extension point already in the term of the Eclipse extension point mechanism and stuff like that. So we should definitely discuss this later on, maybe. So, but before we dive into the details of how exactly a plugin can extend an existing application using extension point technology or the concept of what is an extension point or stuff like that. Maybe we can elaborate a bit more on what is a plugin and what makes a plugin special. So you said that modules are a very generic or very general concept in software engineering, and components are somehow different. And plugins are themselves different from add-ons. Maybe just depending on what kind of application is extended. So if I think about these kind of modules, I think the module has some kind of public visible behavior and public visible API maybe, and some kind of private stuff. Do we have some similar concepts for plugins maybe?
Actually, there are different flavors of plugins. So when I use plugins in the more technical environment, I use it to distinct different applications, basically. So there is some application that comes from the hardware that adds some measurements or measurements or therapy or whatever, and that goes right through up to the user interface. And the idea behind this kind of plugin is that the plugin provides the entire application, so nothing else needed but this plugin. But the other idea is, and that is different in the Eclipse framework, is that plugins do not build upon one each other in this domain. And this is two very different flavors of plugins. Those plugins that build on top of the framework and other plugins, and those plugins that are basically self-contained.
Okay. I see a point, I think. So you think that there are plugins that are maybe built to be used by other plugins or that extend the functionality of the system, but can themselves be reused by other plugins. So they provide some kind of API for other plugins, and there's some kind of plugins that are self-contained in the way that they just add some functionality and that's it.
Yeah, that's the key point. And if you look at, we do embedded software systems basically, and there it is important that some team who has the deep knowledge of, for example, how to do a ventilation, the knowledge about how best to present this to the user is typically also contained in this team or in that same part of the organization. So what we do is we split the teams and the organization into those application knowledge domains. And there we also have the architectural concepts of saying, okay, we provide an infrastructure where you can add all your knowledge, contribute all your knowledge to the overall system that is integrated later on. And you can do it without interference from any other team. Whereas in the Eclipse framework, the idea is different. People provide plugins, and other people say, oh wow, this is great, I can use it. And they build more plugins on top of these. And in the end, you get a fine IDE environment, everything that you need, with kind of all the collective knowledge that has been gathered over years, which is a different approach, also widely successful. But the underlying technology is about the same. That is, you have extensible applications.
Okay. So maybe let's go more into the details how those plugin techniques how they work. So how do these typical plugin technologies how do they work? What existing technologies are there? So I think we have to mention somehow OSGI as one kind of technical foundation for building plugins for applications. Maybe they're self-implemented techniques. So what have you seen?
So for the technology, the underlying technology, to me it is important that we have an installation mechanism that the plugin provider can use, and that we have a kind of, well, I'd say inversion of control, because that's a newly coined term, but it has been there all the time. That is, whoever develops an application prepares that plugins are installed at startup time or at runtime, and it has a kind of registry where it looks for what kind of plugins are there, and then deploys them, makes them run, without exactly knowing what exactly it is, because that would be, yeah, inverting the entire idea of a plugin, because the application must not depend on a particular plugin. It may depend on the fact that there are plugins, but it must not depend on a particular one.
Okay. So what you're basically saying is, if I understand that correctly, is that you somehow need a kind of plugin infrastructure that helps you to discover plugins, which plugins are available, which plugins are installed, that lets the application find those plugins and at least use those plugins, right? Because the application should not know, or the basic infrastructure should not know which plugins are exactly installed, but should be able to discover them maybe at startup time or at runtime. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so and I think OSGI is one of those infrastructures for plugins. So OSGI helps you to discover, in this case for Java, to discover plugins, to load and unload them dynamically. And this is exactly the runtime that is used by the Eclipse platform.
Wow, great. With the more proprietary platforms, applications that I've built and used, we also define the life cycle of plugins. And then a very interesting point comes in, because what we see is that the life cycle of plugins really depends on individual plugin portions. So plugin does not come just by itself, but there's a whole package included. What do I mean by that? If an application kind of scans the registry at startup, it will find there is a number of plugins installed. But depending on the purpose of the application, it does not necessarily start all these at once, but it may offer some of these to the user. And for this you need things like a name and an icon and maybe some help text that really come with the plugin package. But this is not exactly the plugin. That does not fulfill a functionality yet.
So this is more some kind of declarative metadata.
Yeah, you could call it that way, yes.
Okay.
But it may also include a nice photo of some component that you want to control using that plugin. So there could be much involved in there. Not necessarily active software.
Mm-hmm. So in the OSGI world, this would be the manifest file where the name of the plugin is there, and some more information about this plugin, where this comes from, and what version of the plugin is meant by this deployable unit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds like this is the exact analogy.
Okay. I think if we talk about this declarative metadata and that plugins have a life cycle, so they can, I think for me a life cycle means they can be installed and uninstalled at runtime. They can be maybe updated at runtime. They can be started and stopped and stuff like that. Does it sounds similar to your experiences?
What I've seen is that there are different state machines. So typically more than one. The one that controls the lifecycle that you describe is always included. But for those industrial systems, embedded systems that I've been working with, we also have another lifecycle, and that is that of the communication state. and both life cycles interfere. So you could say the communication state is a substate to the overall plugin life cycle.
So what do you exactly mean by communication state? That sounds interesting.
Well, if you have a laboratory environment and you have components that come and go, then your plugins need to react somehow. Yeah? And depending on the application, you need to react differently. So if you have an environment where you want to change settings for some component that isn't present at the very moment, then this GUI portion of the plugin has a different life cycle than that portion of the plugin that does the communications via some network protocol.
Okay, and you mean that, does this mean as well that if I write a plugin and I'm using maybe some other plugins or some communication implementations, stuff like that, that the basic plugin infrastructure should notify me somehow if another plugin comes in and then gets started and gets stopped, so that I can react to those other plugins coming in and then going away?
Yeah, there is always this moment to some degree. And again, there are differences. So maybe we're focusing a bit too much on this technical domain. It just happens to be the case that I'm familiar with that. And what these systems typically have is a detection mechanism of what kind of pluggable components that the user plugs. And this is typically external devices. What kind of components comes in and leaves. So there is always some kind of detection going on. But this is a different detection than what the application does at startup. Because there it scans the registration for what is the actual superset of plugins and, so to say, of externally connected components that I can deal with in total. And we have very little user interaction on that level, because that's basically a topic of installation, and the user does not always install in the technical domain. But the user plugs together the system, and the software then reacts and says, okay, well, we have this plugin lifecycle, and the overall plugin lifecycle has said, yes, I'm loaded, I'm waiting for something to happen. And then we come to the communication lifecycle, meaning now there is something present, and now we start to do the communication, the presentation, and the entire application logic that is associated with that plugin. So, okay, Martin, now I have told you a bit, or maybe a bit more about this technical domain, and well, I'd like to hear how is it using Eclipse?
I think using Eclipse, you have the view of the world is that the world consists out of plugins. So everything is built out of plugins. So if you have very, very minimal plugin infrastructure, and therefore they use the OSGI for as a Java plugin infrastructure, that is, I think, widely used for maybe even technical systems. So it came out of the embedded world. And I think we have a special episode on OSGI. So listen to that episode to get a more detailed view on what is OSGI exactly. But so some advertisement for other episodes. No, but let's no. But I think in Eclipse we have the view of the world is you have plugins, and plugins provide functionality, and plugins can be extended by other plugins. So you have this idea of building plugins on top of other plugins on top of other plugins. And for this, let's say extensibility, you have basically two mechanisms. So you can just use other plugins. I can just say I would like to use the functionality or the implementations or the types of another plugin. This is the direct use relationship, or you can inherit from types there, or all those let's say basic object-oriented mechanisms, just by splitting up the application into smaller parts, and you can define the dependencies between those parts. And the other mechanism is that you have or that you make your plugin extensible. So that is, I think, what you mentioned at the beginning, that you define the application to be extensible and to just make sense if the application is extended. And this is realized in the Eclipse world by the extension point mechanism. So you build a plugin and you say, okay, this is my plugin and my plugin should be extensible. For example, I am the workbench and I have a menu called refactor, um, and this menu should be extensible. So I provide an extension point, I as the implementation of the workbench and the menu refactor, for example. I say I am extensible, and you can extend the menu, and you can plug yourself into my workbench menu by giving me some information, some implementation, and those things. And what I define, or what I tell the world is I am extensible. This is called the extension point. Um, So I say I have an extension point. You can plug yourself into my extension point. You can extend my implementation, my plugin, myself. So other plugins can come in and can extend this menu item by providing an extension to this extension point. So this is, I think, similar to this kind of inversion of control stuff, where you do not say, okay, my workbench and my menu knows all the different menu items, but say, okay, I have a menu and you can extend this menu by providing an implementation of a menu item, together with some decorative metadata or stuff like that. And so another plugin can come in and say, okay, I have an implementation. I would like to say, I implement the Generify refactoring, and I would like to plug this into this menu. So I implement a plugin and I say, okay, I provide an extension to this extension point. So I plug my menu item exactly into this menu in the workbench refactor menu. So this is, I think, the basic idea of extension points in Eclipse, and those can be used all over the place. And the basic idea is that the whole application is built out of those plugins, and that I can say, okay, I would like to add a menu item called Generify, and I offer myself an extension point to say, okay, I implement this menu action Generify, but there might be different algorithms to use to generify stuff in Java code. So I provide an extension point for myself. Say, okay, if other people find more interesting ways to generify Java code, they can plug their algorithm implementations into my menu item Generify. So my menu item itself is going to be extensible, and so on. So it's recursively somehow. So every plugin can be extensible. So, and this, I think, allows me to build really interesting architectures. I think you if you start about thinking your application in terms of plugins instead of thinking about be extensible or be a huge monolithic application, or maybe even a componentized application, then I start to think of which parts of my application are designed to be extensible for the future. And I think this is quite similar to what you said before, that in your more technical domain you have these applications, and those applications, they are built for extensibility. And you can implement, for you mentioned, different algorithms, and they can even maybe 10 years later they can be plugged into the system because the system is designed to be extensible. And I think this fits nicely into this view of building extensible applications and incrementally grow those applications. So you can start small, design a very, very small set, a very, very small application, split this application into smaller parts, and say, okay, this application is extensible. And now maybe other team members or other teams can extend this application and add functionality. And they can even say, okay, our parts are extensible as well. So those applications can grow over time. And I think this is a very, very interesting characteristic, or maybe an interesting feature of plugin based applications. They can be grown over time. Fits nice into this kind of agile, adding stuff to an existing running system, and I think it helps you to think about your systems, not just a technical perspective on how to modularize or how to split up your system into different parts. It helps you think about how to design your system, I think. What do you think?
Well, what you describe is a very fascinating thought, because the systems really grow over time, over generations maybe even, and you cannot really foresee in the very start where we will end. And this is a very interesting thought, because you do not need a master plan in the first place. On the other hand, when I talk about life supporting system, I say, well, we really need to know what's going on in that system. So I'd be more restrictive in that domain, which is, I think, a natural thing to do. So when I talk about extension points, we pretty much know in advance what will be extended there. And all the software that goes to a life supporting system will be controlled by our internal mechanisms. And actually we build all these plugins within our company. But the idea is really not to restrict people in their ideas and in their knowledge, but more to make sure that everything that goes on in the system really fits together well. And so the concept is not exactly as open as you describe it for the Eclipse platform.
So you have some kind of guidelines, or some kind of quality of service agreement, or safety level, or whatever, some kind of contract between the extensible part of the application and the extension, the plugins.
Yeah, we have, and it's fairly detailed. We could do an entire episode out of that.
Okay.
But to make it very brief, the contract contains entry points like I want to add to the number of values that we can display. I want to add to the waveforms we can display. I want to add to the trending behavior. I want to add to the alarm intelligence that we have in place. I want to add to, well, whatever. But all these points are known by the application. So we do not have plugins that build on top of one another, but we have applications that define where plugins could fit in.
But you cannot build plugins that provide themselves new entry points.
We could, of course. That's not a technical problem. But now we're coming to, okay, how are the relations between those different teams that we have? Because plugins for me is a vehicle to separate teams. So we really have so to say, a separation of concern, but no longer on a very technical level, because that is limiting. If you have separations of concerns and you say, well, one is the network developer and another one is the database developer and the third one is the GUI developer, then we kind of have very little room for integrating the application, because then we have to merge all these concerns all of a sudden. So the idea is to split the teams in a different way, and that is per application. or per plugin, so to say. So a plugin is a way to slice applications differently than we know it from the layered architecture. The layered architecture slices in terms of different technology that we use, whereas plugins really can slice and are cuts in the other dimension. They slice per application or per part of the application, and they cut through all the technical domains. And typically in a system you need to have both in some way or another. So you can build this kind of a matrix, technical versus application, and you need to fill all the fields within this matrix. But the interesting point is how do you organize? Who shall work together? And what is your main focus? And what I found is that the main focus on the application really brings you forward much quicker than when you have, so to say, a database or network team, and they are really top-notch, and they are the fastest in the world, but nobody needs what they build. And we only find out later.
Yeah. I think you mentioned a quite interesting architectural characteristic of those plugin-based systems, because if I think about plugin-based systems, or more or less about architectural styles or architectural categorizations, I always think about this kind of layering, these kind of you have persistence layer and a logic layer and UI layer and all those different layers, and that the idea of plugins is somehow orthogonal to those layers. So in plugin-based systems that I build, we often use those layers as ideas. So we separate persistence from logic, from UI, and then maybe some more layers. And orthogonal to this separation, we build plugins for different, let's say, functional parts or domain parts of the system. So we end up with having in this matrix the boxes in this matrix were somehow the plugins. So we have a plugin for, let's say, the persistence for a specific part of the system. We have a plugin for the logic of of the same part of the system, and we have a different plugin for the presentation of the system, and so on. So,
but all these plugins only make sense together, right?
Yeah, definitely. So they in this case, of course, the UI layer plugin of part A of the system will use the logic layer of part A of the system, and this plugin, and will use the plugin for the persistence for part A of the system.
Yeah, and so what we do is we package all these together and say, well, this is, well, we call it one plugin or a plugin package in the end. But this may be just a terminology. But the important thing is that we also scale the organization that way.
But I think it's similar, somewhat similar to in the Eclipse world, to the term feature. So they have a set of plugins, basically is a feature, and you can install a feature, and a feature consists of a set of plugins. So if I say I would like to add accounting management to my banking system, I would add maybe some persistence plugins, some domain logic plugins, some UI presentation plugins, and this package that is cut on the domain level is called feature. So is this similar to what you mentioned with a plugin package?
Yeah, that's exactly the same concept.
Okay, so it seems to me like the Eclipse world, they use maybe different names, but it seems like maybe all the same concepts, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Old stuff.
and that's old stuff, so to say. Yeah, we've been there in the late 90s, and actually I have written a patterns paper back then, and patents always imply that it's no innovation by just one company, but that it's concepts well known in the industry already.
Oh.
So plugins are really not particularly new.
Yeah, we can put a link to your paper into the show notes.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, people can read those patterns, or any other material from the late 90s, you said. So why not? Interesting stuff.
And just be sure to also add more recent links to what's going on in the Eclipse world.
Sure, definitely. We will do this. What I think is interesting about plugin systems as well is that they could help me to scale the system. So if I think about this idea of the Eclipse platform, so I have an IDE platform and I have a Java IDE built on top of this platform, and this Java IDE is a platform itself for building more specific Java IDE stuff for J2EE or stuff like that. And there are some more advanced IDEs, the WTP toolkit or whatever that are built on top of this platform, adding more and more plugins. So my system ends up maybe consisting out of thousands, maybe even thousands of plugins.
Well, could be hard to configure actually.
Yeah, it's for me it's always a challenge to configure my Eclipse IDE the way that I like. But I think what makes the Eclipse platform or the Eclipse plugin infrastructure interesting is that even if you have installed 5,000 or 10,000 plugins into your system, it does not slow down at startup time. It does not slow down at runtime. It just activates those plugins that are actually used during my session. So if I start my IDE and I say, oh, today I'm not interested in EJB at all. Okay, so by the way, I've never been interested in EJB at all, but if I'm not using the EJB features of my WTP plugin installation, those classes are never loaded into the system. Those UI elements are never activated. Those perspectives are never do never consume any memory and stuff like that. So my system can stay pretty small in memory and can be healthy somehow. Because those plugins are not activated. So it would be different if all those 10,000 plugins would be activated and classes are loaded and caches are instantiated and filled with some values or whatever at startup time. So maybe I would just need to start my IDE in the morning to work in the afternoon. And that's not the case. And I think it's a benefit you gain from the plugin architecture and the extension point mechanism that is built into the Eclipse platform. And just as one example of plugin infrastructure.
So what you just show is that the user may select a subset of functionality, and the trade-off is that you have the selected functionality quicker in place for your convenience of usage, but that later on you can have all the functionality. You just have to wait then, or potentially have to wait then. And this resembles pretty much what web browsers do as well. So the Flash plugin is typically not loaded before it's really needed. And then when it's needed, there's even a selection process, like, do you want to start Flash now?
Yeah.
So plugins really offer interesting alternatives, where the user may select things or may choose not to use a particular plugin. And I'm just thinking about those thousands and millions of plugins and how they all interrelate. Maybe it's worth mentioning that in those systems that I've architected or helped architecting, that we have actually different plugins. Different plugins meaning, well, of course, all plugins are different, but we have from the application foreseen different kinds of plugins. So one, those that slice the application, as I've told you. But then we also have places for plugins that integrate other plugins as well. But these are explicitly called integration plugins. And with these plugins, we have the ability to also address or access other plugins that are already there. So this is kind of the product creating plugin. There's suddenly some place where we know everything that's going on in the system, and where we can access private information of plugins that the core of the application is not aware of. And this is really an important thing to add value to the system, because that's where the interesting stuff is going on.
Okay, I see. So, you think that you typically in those applications you have different, let's say, maybe flavors or different kinds of plugins?
Yeah, different kinds of
Yeah.
plugins, or types, so to say. It's actually it on a very large scale it resembles a type system, but that's really a very large scale.
Okay. Maybe too high level for our episode today, right? Maybe.
Well, what we are about, what a lot of things are about in software engineering, is raising the level of abstraction
Yeah.
that we deal with, and by this being more powerful. Yeah, that's a famous proverb. I know it. On the other hand, we know that our ability to envision applications will always exceed our ability to implement them.
It's also often the case, right? That's correct. Yeah.
And it was Grady Booch who said that. So.
Yeah. We had an interview with Grady Booch, but I don't know if he mentioned that in the interview. I don't think so, but maybe we can ask him. So to wrap up somehow this episode, I think maybe we can collect some ideas and some let's say some guidelines or some guidance. When should I use plugins and why should I use plugins? So are there typical situations where you would say in this situation I would use or I would introduce a plugin infrastructure and I would split up the application into different plugins and maybe some ideas.
Well, I'm inclined to use them all over the place. And I just wonder why that is. And I think one of the reasons that we have not mentioned yet is that they also help you to focus. To focus on what is important about the application you build and what is optional.
Mm-hmm.
And you can easily factor out all those things that are optional by saying, oh, I'll put them into a plugin sometime.
Ah, I see. Yeah. I think I observed a pretty similar stuff in one of my projects where we built a platform, or a plugin-based platform for insurance applications. And by adding more and more applications on top of this platform, we observed that we have to make more and more things of the platform optional. So we extracted them out of the platform and we put them into separate plugins that can be used or can be not used, just depending on the application you would like to build on this platform. So yeah, I think I observed a pretty similar thing.
So when would you not use plugins then?
Oh, that's a tough question for me because I think pretty similar the way you think, because I would like to use OSGI and plugin based stuff all the time. I will never implement. I would like to never implement a largest Java system without plugins. But if you ask me that way, maybe I would think if I would build very, very, very small systems, maybe just consisting of a few classes, uh, maybe a few small classes. So maybe you can even implement a huge system out of 5 classes, but and those classes are pretty huge. Um,
I've seen systems like that, so please don't remind me.
Okay. I mean, let's say 5 classes and very, 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 very few methods and lines of code, whatever. So very, very, very small systems. I'm not sure if I would use the huge overhead, not the whole overhead of a plugin infrastructure for that kind of systems. But typically those plugin infrastructures, they're small, they're lightweight, they're fast. So the OSGI example um, is an example for a very small plugin infrastructure. You can even use those plugin infrastructure on a cell phone or on other embedded devices, and maybe even on a Java chip or whatever. So it's even useful for those small memory limited, performance limited environments. So mm,
Yeah, maybe it's a matter of the overhead involved to make a plugin structure work compared to the overall overhead of the project. So if it's more than a few percent, it's probably not worth it.
but do you think it's a lot of overhead to introduce the plugin infrastructure?
Um, it's a lot of overhead. Well, depending on your project size, but the overhead is not to use the infrastructure of plugins, but to really make up your mind of what shall be extensible and what shall not be extensible and what could be optional and so on. So if you have sufficiently small applications, you just are not concerned about all this.
I see. So we haven't talked about this at all, but I think it's an interesting topic to think about. We said that the applications, they need to be designed to be extensible. So does this mean to do a lot of upfront design to make those systems extensible, or maybe not? I know from the Eclipse team that they build those kind of extension points, and those are those points that makes an application extensible. They build those extension points only if they have a client that actually uses this extension point right away. So they do not build those extension points up front just by thinking of this could be a very, very, very nice point to be extensible. They say, okay, we already have a client that asks for this extensibility, and then we provide this extensibility and not upfront.
It's slightly different in the world where I work, but not so much, mm, because the domain knowledge is there, and the domain knowledge also says where a product needs to be extensible for a particular application. So it's well known. Yeah? But then we do it via big design up front. But this is not really something that takes years. Because all the developers familiar with the domain are immediately familiar with the extension points and why they are there. But the difference is maybe in the evolution of what's going on. Because what you describe works probably best if somebody who says, well, this is a very useful plugin and I would like to extend it, somehow can either approach the initial producer of that plugin, the developer, or if he could actually change the plugin because it's open source.
Mm-hmm.
Because then the extension points that are missing can easily be added. And this will make for very powerful architectures actually.
Okay, I think that there are a lot of more questions coming up right now, maybe because of what means extensibility, the evolution of those platforms of APIs and stuff like that. But maybe it's a bit too much for this episode. We can discuss this in a future episode maybe. So it was a long wrap up. And so would you like to add something at the end? Some kind of some pearls of wisdom?
Some pearls of wisdom. Well, don't be afraid if you cannot make use of the Eclipse framework. It's still possible to do plugins, and it's worth it.
Great. So Klaus, thank you very, very much for this episode and for being on the show, and hope to hear you soon again.
Yeah, that was great fun. Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Software Engineering Radio. If you want more information about the podcast and all the other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. If you want to support us, you can donate to the SE Radio team via the website, or you can advertise for SE Radio, for example, by clicking on the Dig, Reddit, Delicious and Slashdot buttons. To contact the team, please send email to team@seradio.net, or if it's specific to an episode, please use the comments facility on the website so other people can read and react to your comments. This episode of Software Engineering Radio, as well as all other episodes, are licensed under a Creative Commons license. Please see the website for details. Thanks to Charlie Crow and the Podsafe Music Network for the music used in this show. The song is called Vegas Hard Rock Shuffle.